talk about zones today. Over the next 10 minutes or so, I want to describe to you guys how the terms I use for training zones, and then how those terms relate to exercise physiology. All right, so first off, you need to imagine your effort on a spectrum from easy to maximum, and that's represented on this bar up here, where the bottom here is easy, and the harder you go, the farther up the bar you go up until you're at maximum effort. The terms that I use when I'm riding a bike workout or a run workout, if I want you to go easy, I call that easy. The next higher level is, I call that long. Sometimes I say endurance zone or conversational or aerobic. As you continue to go harder, the next important level is the lactate threshold. A little bit harder than that is VO2 max, and a little bit harder than that is above VO2 max or super VO2 max. All right, these are relatively simple terms, and I use these all the time. Where it gets confusing is when you try to correlate these things to the literature or to blogs or media, because there's a lot of terms that people use to name these same categories. It gets very confusing. So for example, when we're talking about this long run pace or long pace, bike ride, whatever, there's a lot of terms that you may see, like LT1 or some people call this the lactate threshold because it's when you begin to see lactate in the blood above baseline. Some people call it the anaerobic threshold. Some people call it the aerobic cap. Some people call it the onset of blood lactate, VT1. But whatever it's called, it's somewhere in the range of 55 to 88% of your VO2 max. So basically 55 to 88% of what you can maximally do aerobically. And that's a huge range right there. And the reason there's such a wide range is that people are just different. Some people are fitter than other people. And the fitter you are, the higher of a percentage of your VO2 max you can exercise at and still be primarily aerobic. So this is your aerobic zone. So basically, as you go harder, you reach a certain point at which you're no longer maximizing your aerobic potential. This is it right here. Anything above this, you're not going to use any more aerobic metabolism. You have to start calling in your anaerobic metabolism. All right. So that covers the aerobic or your long zone. All right. So if you jump up to the next critical point, we're talking about lactate threshold. Again, there's a lot of different terminology for this. LT2, anaerobic threshold, ventilatory threshold number 2, a lot of different terms. I call it lactate threshold because it's when you actually see critical values of lactate in the blood, the point where you actually feel it. All right, you guys may experience this as when your muscles start to burn. All right, and some people call this lactic acid. All right, so just a little side note here, lactic acid is formed when you are using anaerobic metabolism, but it only lasts an instant before it's broken into lactate and an acid, a hydrogen ion, right? Lactate can actually be used for fuel, but it's that hydrogen ion, that acid, that actually can gunk up your muscle machinery, all right? So that's where you get that burn. You feel that burning feeling, it's from the acid, all right? But lactate in and of itself isn't bad, but we measure lactate as the byproduct, and that's how we know when you've reached a critical point. So you're actually accumulating lactate in your blood at this point. And this occurs anywhere from 70 to 95% of your VO2 max. And again, like the long run zone or long pace, this wide range is due to the high variability of fitness. Okay, the fitter you are, the closer to 100% of your VO2 max you'll be. Now, highly trained endurance athletes are in the 80 to 90% range. That's pretty good. Rarely do you see 95% of your VO2 max as your lactate threshold, but anyway. Okay, that's a small window, and that's represented here, where your lactate threshold effort is just a really small window. If you keep going harder, there's another point, which is we call the VO2 max, and this is the exercise intensity at which you're using the maximum amount of oxygen possible for you, okay? And that can correlate to a running pace or a power on the bike, but anyway, there's an oxygen limit that you can process, and then that can correlate to a performance metric. You can exercise harder than that. So for example, somebody's VO2 max may be at 300 watts on the bicycle, But for very, very short amounts of time, they can put out way more watts than that. So anything above a VO2 max effort, we call a super VO2 max effort. So for example, our 5-second bike efforts are a super VO2 max effort. The terms that you may see in the literature and blogs, interval work is sometimes super VO2 max efforts. Alactate, that means you're actually working for such a short amount of time that you don't actually use lactate. So we call that out lactate, which means without lactate. And then sometimes if it's a long enough session, like a Wingate session, you do get quite a bit of lactate accumulation. So this could be a lactate workout. So anyway, take home message here that I want you guys to get from the right side, all these words over here on the right, is that as you go up the intensity spectrum, there are critical points. We got the long zone, and then there's this little gray area in here where you're kind of in no man's land. Then there's the lactate threshold zone. Then you get another little gray area, your VO2 max, and then anything above that is like really hard efforts. Okay. The other thing I want you guys to take note is that there's a lot of different terms that you may come across if you're reading a blog or reading literature. Don't get confused with the terms. It's really simple. Easy, long, threshold, VO2 max, above VO2 max. Basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 zones. That's it. Okay. Now, how does this correlate to muscles? All right, as you begin exercise, your muscles begin to work, and they work in this order. You first recruit your type 1 muscles. These are the big muscle fibers. They are oxidative and slow twitch. All right, so if you've ever heard of slow twitch muscles, they're also the type 1 muscles. Oxidative means they primarily use oxygen, or they burn fat for fuel. All right, so type 1 fibers, they have a lot of endurance. They can go a long time. Postural muscles, like on your back, are incredibly slow twitch, very red. If you ever cut a muscle open, the type 1 fibers are very red, which means they're very oxygenated, very full of blood. The redder they are, the more oxygenated they are. So type 1 get recruited first. Now, as you go up the intensity spectrum, there comes a point where you're going to increase the intensity to the point where your type 1 muscles aren't going to be able to handle that amount of work. So you begin recruiting additional muscles. And the second type of muscles you recruit are called your type 2As. All right, so type 2 muscle fibers are your fast twitch muscles. And in general, in an untrained person, they're primarily glycolytic, meaning they're anaerobic, primarily using glucose for fuel or sugar for fuel. There's a little bit of oxidative capacity in these guys, which means they do have some endurance components to them. But if you're untrained, these muscles tire out quickly. So you can imagine that if you get too far above this aerobic level, if you're untrained, you're going to get tired pretty quickly and you're going to start to feel that burn. If you keep increasing the intensity, you're going to get up to the point where you have to recruit all your muscles. And the very last muscle fibers to be recruited are the type 2Xs. These are super powerful muscles. They're fast glycolytic. They're super fast twitch muscles. They are only glycolytic. So they have very little oxidative properties. They burn on carbohydrate. They fatigue very quickly, but they're very powerful. These are the jumping and the explosive muscles. All right. And these are only used when you do like really hard bursts, like high intensity training or kettlebell work in the gym or any kind of really explosive work. All right, and the muscles are recruited in this order. So you start with your type 1s, and then the more intense the exercise, you recruit type 2s, and then the more intense, then you recruit your type 2Xs. All right, so now you can kind of understand the interconnection between the muscle fiber type, how the muscles oxidize or how the muscles metabolize fuels, whether they're oxidative or glycolytic. Glycolytic is when you get that lactic acid formation and the lactate accumulation in the body. And the harder you go, the more of these type 2As and type 2Xs you use, therefore accumulating in more lactate production, less ability to sustain those efforts. All right. Okay, so moving on, what happens when we train? All right, obviously with training, you'd expect some changes in all these variables, and that's exactly what happens. So let's pretend that somebody undergoes a quality training program for 4 to 6 months. All right, even less sometimes. But here's what you could expect to happen on this picture. Okay, first off, look at the maximum level here. Obviously, if you're training, you're going to increase your ability to do maximal work. All right. As a result, you're going to see an increase in obviously the maximal work, and hopefully an increase in your VO2 max. All right, you're able to consume and use more oxygen at your use more oxygen, right? That's the VO2 max. Okay, in addition, you're going to be able to do more work while being able to buffer that lactate. So your lactate threshold level is going to go up. You're going to be able to put out more power on the bike. You're going to be able to run a faster pace while at your lactate threshold level. So you're able to buffer and use lactate while going at a higher effort. Okay, that's all the high intensity stuff. Now down here in the aerobic area, you're basically building your aerobic base. So you're able to use your aerobic stores longer. So your aerobic level is going to increase. Therefore, your long efforts, your long bikes and your long runs and your easier long swims are going to be able to be done at a higher effort or a faster pace. All right, it won't feel any different, and metabolically it'll look the same, but you're going to be putting out more watts, or you're going to be running at a faster pace. Okay. Now, why this happens, one of the primary adaptations to endurance training occurs right here in these type 2A fibers. Type 2A fibers are incredibly plastic, and by that I mean they are able to transform themselves to be like a type 1 fiber. All right. So these type 2As in an untrained person are primarily glycolytic, but the more you train, the better these muscles are at using oxygen for fuel, or oxygen for, they use fat for fuel. So they become more oxidative. All right. So a highly trained endurance athlete, if you take muscle biopsies, you're going to see a lot of type 1 fibers, but you're going to see a lot of type 2A fibers, yet they're going to be surrounded by mitochondria, and they're going to look more like a type 1 fiber. All right. So the benefit there is that you're getting a lot of endurance and a lot of power out of these muscles. Okay. Okay. Hopefully that puts a lot of this physiology stuff in perspective on this kind of a spectrum from easy intensity to high intensity. All right, now what I want to do is I want to finish up with explaining why it's important to know these zones and apply them to training. And I'm going to use running as the primary example, but this applies to swimming and biking and any cross-country skiing, any other kind of activity where you're doing sustained efforts. All right, this should look familiar to you now. All right, we have easy all the way up to maximum. When we do physiology testing, the two critical points that I look for and that most good physiologists look for are, when you're going from easy to hard, where do you cross over this line right here? Where do you begin to use more anaerobic metabolism? Like, where is your aerobic system maximized? All right. Because once we know where your aerobic system is maximized, we know that you shouldn't exercise at an intensity higher than that if you're looking for aerobic benefit. All right. Let's say this is it correlates to 8-minute per mile pace. All right. So if you're, or a heart rate of 150, okay, everybody's different. So I'm just using these as examples. If you go harder than that, you're basically not getting any more aerobic benefit than you would if you would just keep it right at or below this line, but you're working harder than you need to. So basically you're being inefficient. All right. You're exercising harder than you need to get the benefit that you're looking for. All right, so that's your aerobic cap, and that's why it's important to keep your long efforts, whether it be on the bike or on the run, it's important to keep your long efforts under your aerobic cap. Okay, the next important variable or point that we look for is way up here at the lactate threshold level. All right, so identifying your lactate threshold is important because a lot of cool stuff begins to happen here metabolically. All right, your body begins to produce more lactate than you can clear. So your enzymes and your body is really learning how to use lactate for fuel and buffer the acid. All right. And the ability to buffer that acid and use lactate is going to be very beneficial for sustaining higher intensity exercise. So knowing where your lactate threshold or your threshold effort is a critical point, because we like to train at and slightly above this effort. That's why there's a range here. Let's just say that somebody's lactate threshold is at 6 minutes per mile, all right? Or maybe they have the heart rate monitor and it's like 170 beats per minute. All right, what we do is we prescribe workouts that get them to hover around that pace or that heart rate effort for a certain duration, recover, and then crank it right back up. So their body produces the lactate. They have to sustain effort while dealing with that lactate production. Then we recover, and then we repeat it over and over again. So this is a really critical point. You get a lot of good benefits in training if you know exactly where this is. And again, it's a range. All right, so it ranges anywhere from 5 to 15 seconds per mile, and on the bike it may be anywhere from 10 to 30 watts. That your lactate threshold will be the range there, and we can play around with that. So, but knowing approximately where that is a very important point. All right, so how does this relate to running and the importance of knowing your running paces when you're training for a race? When you're looking at your marathon pace, unfortunately, it falls a little bit above this aerobic cap. All right. But for those of you that have run a marathon, you know that marathon pace isn't that hard, especially if you're only going 10 or 15 miles. I mean, if you're going to run a race for 26 miles, you better be able to sustain that for 10 or 15 miles with relatively little perceived exertion. It shouldn't feel very hard. So as you know from watching the video so far, this is above the effort where you're using primarily aerobic. You're actually calling upon a little bit of anaerobic. So clearly running marathon pace requires anaerobic conditioning. The problem is, of course, that we see a lot of people run their long runs at or faster than marathon pace, and you can immediately see why that's a problem. If this is the fastest you're supposed to run or the hardest you're supposed to exercise to get an aerobic benefit, and the purpose of a long workout is to get an aerobic benefit, when you're running at your marathon pace or harder than your marathon pace, you're clearly in this gray zone here, okay? Half marathon pace is in the same predicament. All right, obviously you're going to run your a half marathon faster than your full marathon, but it is also in this gray zone. And for many people, it falls just below the lactate threshold level. All right, so again, half marathon pace, yeah, feels a lot harder, but it's still in this gray zone. You're not running hard enough to really get the lactate threshold workout benefit, and you're running way too hard to get an aerobic benefit. All right, so 10K pace is kind of in that sweet spot. So sometimes when we talk about lactate threshold work, we estimate our 10K pace, and we actually use that as a good barometer for something like a mile repeat workout or 800 workouts. And 5Ks are sort of in this like right at the high end of your lactate threshold and maybe a little bit higher than lactate threshold. All right, so hopefully you can see here from this graph and what I've been talking about where these race paces fall in this spectrum of easy to hard. All right. The goal of this, of course, was to give you a little physiology lesson and try to explain the terms that I use for this spectrum of intensity, and then try to throw some actual race conditions in there so you can kind of correlate what a full marathon, half marathon, 10K, 5K, where those efforts should fall in this spectrum, and then how they relate to the critical zones, the aerobic cap and the lactate threshold. All right, that's it for the physiology lesson. Please, if you have any questions, email me at joe@Endurance Company, or keep the discussion going on the Endurance Company Facebook page.